and that America has chosen throughout its history, but certainly since at least our Civil War in the 1860s, to turn its face away from the terrible truths of its own history, to tell itself comforting lies and myths and fantasies, and to not do the difficult work that Germany obviously had to do after the war of confronting the horrors of your own history in order to rebuild, in order to build going forward. And the United States has never done that. We have not had any reckoning with our past. So in terms of whether it was comforting or not, I mean, I was always torn about that, because I would change, sometimes in the same day. It would be, because I agree with you, in some ways it is comforting to know that it's not unprecedented and that America has survived this before and maybe we can survive it again. On the other hand, it is unprecedented and certainly now. I mean, I wrote the book in 2017. It is unprecedented in how deep and how powerful basically the short version is the story that I'm telling never made it to the White House before. So it was there, but it didn't have this kind of power. It didn't have this kind of validity and legitimacy. And even when I was writing the book, I didn't understand to the degree to which the Republican Party would be prepared to give literally anything that Trump did legitimacy, up to and including now insurrection. And today they are arguing that he should not be impeached. Nikki Haley stood up and said, "Let the man move on. Let him move on." So obviously that's not comforting. So the fact that we keep doing it and we never learn from it is not comforting at all. It's deeply worrying. It's a cancer that keeps growing and we don't cut out the tumor. So to say we keep surviving cancer, is that something we take comfort in or not? And so to me, it's a disease that we have to admit we have in order to cure it. But we have lived with that disease for a long time. So it may be that this isn't the time the disease takes us down either. I don't know. I don't know if that cheers anybody up or not.
That's very interesting. That was my second question, actually. But we had an event this summer with Susan Neiman. I don't know if you know her. She's a philosopher, very famous in German. She is the head of the Einstein Forum, but she's like a Berlin institution. But she's from Georgia, from Atlanta, actually. She's an American Jew. And she wrote a very thick book about just about that topic, that America has never come to terms with it the way Germany has come over decades. It didn't come to us in like 5 minutes. And she's actually a bit hopeful. Like she says there's like signs in the South, for example, that people are trying to work this through and trying to get to like a starting point for what you're not too hopeful about, I think.
Well, I am hopeful, and I agree with that assessment that that work is starting to be done. It's particularly starting to be done by the younger generation, who are demanding that confrontation, who are demanding that honesty, because they can see the corruption and how it is stopping the promises of America from being fulfilled towards, democracy and equality and justice and all of the obvious ones, freedom. And I think the fact that, for example, the first museum of lynching was opened in the last few years, but it was a young man who started that and said this has to be done. I do take comfort from that. But I also, when I'm asked about the question of American fascism, I do say I take comfort from the example of Germany. And sometimes people think I'm being facetious, but I'm absolutely telling the truth, because the whole point is that painful reckoning that German society has been able to undertake. And as you say, it has taken a long time, and it's not finished, and it's not, history isn't complete and something we can put to one side. And neither is democracy. But we can see how German democracy has strengthened itself. And I take hope from that, that societies can come back from the worst horrors. And if they decide to, they can rebuild. And that's what America is going to have to do.
Right back to where the book actually starts, because I want to make that clear for the people joining us who haven't read it yet. Something that's quite demanding in the first, I think, like 60, 70 pages of the book but worthwhile while being demanding is that you have to keep up with the constant like changing and shape-shifting of the two central ideas. It's a genealogy basically of the terms, and you have to really keep up or your head will swirl a little bit. But you learn to understand that that's very important, that you get to understand where this automatic knowledge in a way comes from, because it's like you explain how cultural chains of association work. And that's always something I'm not sure I've ever read it laid out as clear, because I was always fascinated that some concepts are like, we know what they mean, even though no one really ever explained them to us. Like we get their undertones and their changing colors, and we get it even though we haven't read a dissertation on it. And you do that so well. And I wonder, is that like something you had to make plain to yourself, or did you always have this kind of like code, maybe Da Vinci Code of cultural association?
Well, thank you. First of all, I'm glad that you enjoyed that part of it. It was a really important part of the book for me. It's really kind of the key to the book, as far as I'm concerned. So, as you say, the book asks you to treat these two phrases, American Dream and America First, as the protagonists of the story rather than individuals. So I'm not following humans, although there are lots of humans in the story, of course, but they come and go. And it's the phrases that stay and how their meaning changes over the course of their emergence. And then as they became more and more popular, they became more and more contested. So when they're quiet and submerged and gently coming out, they're obviously, people aren't fighting over what they mean. And by the end, they're really fighting over what these phrases mean and how they're going to shape American politics and, American society. But, I trained as a literary critic. I have a PhD in literature, as you said, rather than in history. But all of my work, my research sits where, at one of the points where literature and history meet. And of course, there are many points where they meet, but one of them is, to me, is the ways in which language works in ways that a literary critic would pay attention to, like metaphoric chains of association, like codes, like, figurative meanings rather than everything being a literal meaning, and connotation, not just denotation. All of those, as you say, very kind of instinctive ways that we use language unconsciously. We do it all the time. We're always decoding language. But literary critics train ourselves to become conscious of that and to never be unconscious about it. That's kind of the whole project as a literary critic, is to try to never be unconscious about uses of language. It's very difficult, of course. So I won't say that I've achieved it, but that's the goal. And so what I wanted to do was to bring what I would call that sensibility, that mindset. It's a kind of attitude, really, to language. And I wanted to bring that to bear on primary historical texts that we wouldn't usually use that kind of literary analysis on. And yes, it was very conscious for me from the beginning. It was, as I say, it was the heart of this book. It was its whole raison d'etre, really, was that when Trump started using America First as his slogan, everybody took it at face value and nobody understood the code. And because I'd been reading in the history, I knew what the code was. And so I just felt like I had this job to demystify and to say, this is a code and they know it's a code, and I can prove it's a code, and I can prove that they know it's a code. And that's kind of what I want to do, because that's how code works, as I say, is that it's, as I say in the book, is that a code is there not just to disguise our meaning from each other, but that's of course very, very important, but it's there to disguise our meaning from ourselves, so that we don't have to admit that we're actually saying something quite terrible, and we can pretend to ourselves that what we're saying is perfectly innocent, when we know deep down inside it isn't really. So for me, the whole point of the book was to say these codes don't mean what you think they mean. And that's really what I was trying to do.
Yeah, that's actually, that was on my list of questions for the first section that I can.
Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead.
No, it's actually perfect, because now you gotten right into it. But I was going to mention that I still have Donald Trump in my ear when he first said, like, I can hear it like an audio tape, when he said, from now on, it's only going to be America first. I can perfectly hear it. And it's like, it shocked me in a way, because that's probably part of me that's German and is sensible to these kinds of phrases and repeatings. And I knew it wasn't new, but I connected it, as you point out in the book, back to Charles Lindbergh, the Hitler apologist, basically, who almost became president in some ways, which Philip Roth wrote about. There's just been an HBO miniseries, and you explain how much further back it goes, but it doesn't get prettier. Like this, there's no like a very nice meaning that just gets submerged in some ways. I was wondering, is that something that is it taken for granted in America that people just forget every 20 minutes what the past meant, and that's why you can just repeat it? I mean, also the election slogan was stolen from Ronald Reagan too, so it's not like this is like a first one-time offense. It's like
yeah, absolutely. And Reagan stole it from somebody else. I mean, we keep forgetting things so that we can pretend that they're new. Yes, America does have an investment, an emotional and psychological collective investment in forgetting its own past. It's the only way that we can keep pretending that we're innocent all of the time. So we have to not know what we did. We have to very carefully, keep our blinkers on and make sure that we don't know what's happening over there. And so we don't know what's happening now. And we certainly don't want to know what happens in the past, except that we're the good guys, always. So it's a very infantile version of history, but it stretches back a long way. I mean, Scott Fitzgerald wrote about it in a story called The Swimmers. I quote this in the book, that he says that there's a tradition in America that education should not weigh you down. That history is this weight that will stop your mobility. And because America has this need for freedom, and that includes emotional and psychological freedom, it just keeps casting off anything that might weigh it down. But you can only do that for so long. And I think that we're coming to one of those moments of national and historical reckoning where the past has caught up with us. We've tried for 150 years to pretend that the Civil War didn't happen the way it happened, and that it didn't have the consequences that it had. Or indeed, that slavery, go back before the Civil War, that slavery didn't have the consequences that it had, that all of American history hasn't had the consequences that it's had. And every time we think we can't pretend anymore, America manages to push that aside and to pretend again. So we thought, when I was young, we thought that Rodney King was going to be the moment that we could never get past. And then we thought it was going to be, Trayvon Martin would be the moment that we could never get past, or the Columbine shootings, or why am I forgetting the name? Sandy Hook, the terrible school shooting, where the small, these nursery school, 4-year-old babies were murdered. But we moved on. America just throws it out and moves on. So we're all looking at this now and thinking, surely this will be the moment that America cannot finally pretend didn't happen. But as I said when we started, the Republican Party is busily trying to do that right now, saying, let's move on. Let's not spend any time dwelling on what Donald Trump did 3 weeks ago. That's over and done with. Time to move on. Which is a classic American response, and it's why we're in the trouble we're in. But we'll have to see what happens.
I think to see here is the motto, then, like the next motto, I think.
Yeah. Oh, it's always easier, right? You just keep, it's classic of, as an adult, as a human, as an individual, it's classic avoidance. Oh, well, that bill is due. Well, I won't open the envelope. I'll pretend that bill isn't due. The bill is still due. And at one point, you will have to pay it. It just depends on when the collectors come pounding on the door. And that's the part we don't know yet.
So what you've described just now is a little bit also the background of the book, in a way that the American dream, like this, we haven't talked about that much so far, but this lofty concept that just changed meaning very much over the last 100 years, basically. But it's still like a kind of placeholder for idealism, for liberalism, in a way, like it can be, at least, let's say that. And America First is this motto of the more authoritarian, nationalist, nativist strain in American thought, basically. And what it basically adds up to is a battle for the soul of the nation. So what I was wondering, were you the one person alive who wasn't very much underwhelmed when Joe Biden unveiled that as the slogan for his campaign in April of 2019, or 2,000 years ago.
Exactly. No, I just had a lot of my editor and my friends and my family all kept saying, we need to send Joe Biden your book, because then you'll explain to him what the battle for the soul of the nation is. Indeed, it's on like the jacket of the book, isn't it? It's on the cover. I think the publisher put it there. And so, so I said in 2018, that's where we are. And it was funny because when my publisher said we should use that phrase, I said, oh, but it's a little bit of a cliche, right? It's a bit trite. And then, so I felt vindicated when Biden used it. I just hoped that everybody would see that, would decide to anyway, to vote for that side, the side that can tell the truth about it being a battle. So to explain for your audience who presumably haven't read the book. So the American dream, that phrase that we all know so well, speaking of cliches, the book traces the emergence of that phrase as an idiom, as a national expression or slogan. But particularly to show that the meanings that it has now that are so tied with ideas about upward social mobility, about economic self-improvement, about the American success story and pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and all of these things are a later version of what the American dream meant. And when it first emerged, it was a critique from the left of corruption and monopoly capitalism as it was taking hold of American society at the turn of the 20th century. So in the 1880s and the 1890s, when American industry took off and people like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Mellons were making all of the money and buying up everything in Europe they could get their hands on, and carting it home. They were this argument, this criticism on the left, on the progressive left, developed that said, this kind of monopoly capitalism and this new phenomenon called a multimillionaire, which had never been seen before, is going to destroy the American dream of democracy. It's going to destroy the American dream of equality. And it's going to destroy the American dream of justice, because those things can't coexist in a place with rampant economic inequality. So this was the moment when the phrase, the idea of the 99% and the 1% was coined. Because it was a reality then as well. And so we really see the same conversations replicating themselves. But what's so interesting is that when they had this debate 100 years ago, the American dream was on the side of what we would call social democracy, on the side of government regulation to protect the individual from free market capitalism. And of course, today, the American dream is used on the right, certainly in America anyway, as a way to argue for free market capitalism. They assume that that's what the American dream is. So what I do in the book is show how that emerged and then how the meaning flipped. And then as Renee says, the America First is also an older slogan that is more consistently tied with the forces of isolationism and nativism. And its story is more that it gained a lot of traction in the first decades of the 20th century. And then because of Charles Lindbergh and his association with, and as you rightly say, he was basically an apologist for Hitler, arguing for appeasement. The course of the Second World War meant that that idea would fall into disrepute after the Second World War. And then we just had to have enough time pass for Americans to forget all of that and be able to start all over again and decide that America First was a good thing, because they didn't even know it was associated with Lindbergh, much less that it was associated with anything earlier. So when Trump resuscitated it, a lot of American commentators and media said, oh, this is a Lindbergh phrase. This is about the Second World War. This is about Nazi appeasement. And what I wrote the book in part to do was to say it's actually older than that. And by the time Lindbergh used it, it had this whole cultural weight that they all understood in the 1930s and 1940s that we have to recover to understand what it means now.
Actually, one, because it fits in well here, I think, even though I'm not sure what you'll make of it, but a figure that stands in a very uncomfortable tension in your book, and I think in history, between these two big ideas. And I remember him so well from your book, but also from his gaining traction. in a way, is not the almost President Lindbergh, but the actual President Wilson, who has become a very complicated figure in recent years, I think, in a way. I remember him from my history books, what we learned about American history, basically in Germany in middle school, the League of Nations and the First World War. He was a positive figure in a way, a progressive figure. He was a university man in a way. He was a progressive leader in some regards, but he also was the person who showed Birth of a Nation in the White House as the first movie ever. And he was a very, very racist person. And so I wonder what you make of this figure, and if you think he's maybe somewhere between these ideas and also between the Gilded Age and the Progressive era, which is the time frame where your book basically plays out for the people in the audience. Is that how do you think about Wilson, maybe in relation to Trump even?
Well, I mean, I think Wilson was, for all of Wilson's failings, and they were very real and very significant, as you say. I mean, I'd take Wilson over Trump any day of the week, honestly, because he meant well by his own understanding. Trump, you can't even say that about Trump. Trump doesn't mean well on any level. And Wilson was a good example of what I was talking about a minute ago about Americans convincing themselves of their own innocence. I think Trump is very well aware of his own guilt. But Wilson believed that he, told himself that he was doing the right thing. He was we need to remember just what his historical background was. He was raised in the slaveholding South by a slaveholding family. People forget how old he was. So, and how close we are to the American Civil War. We think of that as being ancient history, and Wilson as being, he's kind of, he's World War I, so he's the beginning of kind of modern history. And the Civil War, that's ancient history. Well, they were only 50 years apart. And so Wilson was raised by a slaveholding family to be a racist, and he was a racist. He believed in white supremacy. He believed that white people were fit to govern and that Black people were not fit to govern. But he was, he wasn't. So he upheld racist structures, but he didn't set out to oppress Black people per se, right? So he was sort of in that space where he was certainly racist, and I'm not apologizing for it. He was the person who introduced racial segregation to the U.S. government, to the federal government, because it had always been only on the local level before. And he brought it in at the federal level. But as you say, he was also this liberal internationalist. So basically, he was, well, first of all, I think he's a good example of how we need to have a less childish version of our own history, and to recognize that most people are a complicated mix of good and bad motives and good and bad values. And even to say good and bad is to be childish, right? So as you say, it's a complicated figure. I think that complexity is important. I think it's important that we recover that, and we stop talking about good guys and bad guys and racists and not racists, and recognize how white power is implicated in how you can try to be a non-racist and still be caught up in power structures that are supported by white supremacists and that are supported by white governance, for example, to talk about, what's happening now. So I think Wilson is very instructive in that way. He's a figure we can learn a lot from, because he forces us to get away from good guys and bad guys and to look at human beings in their full complexity, and to recognize they can be very good in some ways and very bad in other ways.
That's very interesting, and actually it helps me a lot understanding this figure. I've read a little bit about him, and he didn't seem to get any easier. But that's a good frame to think about this, I think. So what your book also is, and I think that's something that's very timely as well, is like a kind of welcome reminder for maybe normal people who don't engage with history on a daily basis, I would say.
Who are these so-called normal people?
Well, I haven't met any. It kind of, maybe you even disagree with this, but current collective memory in a way, maybe it's in Germany only, I don't know, but maybe you can tell me, overemphasizes American history of the 20th century after 1945 and underplays the first 3 decades in a way. Like it's just not that present. So it's like, one example is reading about presidential campaigns and like their concerns and people running on the same slogan for 4 elections and people nominating a Supreme Court justice for president for some reason. That seems like a very strange and exotic experience right now. It doesn't feel as recognizable as everything. Like this strain of history since not 1945 now feels like it could never have happened any other way. It's like just one, up until Trump, of course, for Germans at least.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's a then we took a sharp turn.
Do you think there's any chance that like our current like running first 3 decades of the 21st century could also be like a kind of brewing backwater, not yet like the main act for people of the second?
What a thought. Well, of course it's possible. I mean, I'm afraid it must be possible, right? I mean, I think you're absolutely right that, first of all, I agree with you with your description of that collective memory. I think that's true not only in the ways that I've seen American history taught in Europe, and of course I'm coming to you from London, as I assume you said in your introduction. So I guess I can't call London Europe anymore, but I'm still going to. I'm sorry. And so I certainly see that collective memory of being much more interested in post-war America than in interwar America, which is one of the reasons that I focus on interwar America and that I'm so interested in it. And I think, again, that forgetting aspects of that history is what has doomed us to repeat it to a certain extent. So I totally agree with your characterization, and I think we would do well to recover that history, which is why I wrote a book about it, and why I've been writing essays about it that kind of supplement the book, some of the essays that you mentioned. As far as making predictions, well, you know, historians are not, we're not known for our accuracy in prediction, and I certainly, I mean, I thought Trump would not win in 2016, so I should not make any predictions. But I think that we are in a period of such turmoil that it has to be transitional by definition. And that includes not just American politics, but obviously the pandemic and the rise of nationalism globally, and, you know, and the rise of China, and all of the really major obvious turning points and points of transformation from the geopolitical order that most adults grew up taking for granted and thinking that was, as you say, always the way of things. But of course, our study of history teaches us that it was not always the way of things, and that outcomes are contingent. They're deeply contingent. And that's why counterfactuals like Philip Roth's novel, What Would Have Happened If Lindbergh Had Been President, all of the counterfactuals of what would have happened if, you know, if the Nazis had won the war, what would, or, you know, the Axis. And, you know, I think those are really useful exercises for us to try to remind ourselves of how fragile and how contingent history is, that nothing is foreordained. But what that means is that in a moment of great turmoil like right now, we're even less equipped than normal to be able to make decent predictions. I think there's just too much noise and too much chaos, and we simply don't have the ability to guess in advance which are going to be the strains that see us through and which are going to be the ones that drop away. Yeah. I just don't know.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. It also explains a little bit about the unpredictability of election results these days, that everything just turns out completely different than anyone has ever predicted it. Before I try to connect to that, I want to encourage people for the last section of tonight to type in their questions into the chat function, which you can find down below, because Sarah has agreed to answer a few questions as the finale of tonight's online talk. So you can do that already if you want to gather your thoughts, and I will read them out, or a selection of them at the end. So to connect it back to the present, basically, we've talked a lot about like the weight of terms and the complex making of ideas and concepts. And I wonder, I mean, I don't want to put you in the same situation I've just put you in to predict the future, but do you have any kind of feeling about what people in 100 years, which is the same amount of time from us to the progressive era, basically, what people will make of the term MAGA, and also like what like taste and flavor it will have acquired by then. And also, did you hear anything in Joe Biden's inaugural address that might have the same heft, or will maybe stick to the memory of people when he's done and when people years of now live?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think to take the MAGA first, you know, obviously Trump is making noises about maybe creating a MAGA party that would split from the Republican Party. If it actually becomes a political party, then MAGA will be remembered if the United States survives. Whether it's a footnote to that history or a major important part of it, again, only the success of that party will determine that. But I think that I hope that it becomes a footnote to Trump. I hope that Trump becomes a footnote to American democracy, and that MAGA becomes a footnote to him. But that is about whether we can, whether we can start to tell a deeper and more truthful and more honest version of our history, and therefore of our national story. Therefore, not just of who we used to be or who we think we used to be, but who are we now? And can we tell the truth about that? And if we can't, then I think that MAGA will have more traction, because that is one of the calling cards of that willful blindness, of that's the veil, right? Is just shouting, "Make America Great Again," as if that will, solve all of the problems. And that, using nationalism as the kind of, as the kind of fig leaf for everything else. In terms of Biden's inaugural address, look, there was very little of the kind of high-flown rhetoric that makes inaugural addresses historically. I mean, he quoted Lincoln actually a fair amount, but Joe Biden is never going to be an orator like Lincoln, or indeed like Obama. But I think that he did a couple of things that were really important in that speech. For me, the most important thing was that he called out the lies, and he talked about the fact that there are lies for profit and there are lies for power. That was already more truth-telling than America has done in a long time. And even Obama, in some ways, was constrained from doing that because of the racial tensions that he had to navigate and that he had to inhabit. He wasn't given the cultural permission to tell the truth in the same way that Joe Biden is allowed to, because he's a white man. So Biden has more latitude, and he took it, and that's good from my point of view. I also think it was good that he didn't try to do the rhetoric, because he's not good at oratory in that sense. He's not going to be, lyrical and poetic, but he was talking about a nation in a deep crisis, and about the kind of pragmatic steps that need to be taken to turn a tanker. So, he came in and he said, look, here's how we're going to spin it to the left. And this is what we need to do in order to spin it to the left, and not a vision of where we're going to get to, but just how do we not drown? And when you're drowning, I think you want a leader who says, here's the bucket, bail, and doesn't make big speeches about why you need to bail. It's just get the water out of the boat, and then we'll think about vision, and then we'll think about oratory. So for me, it was a welcome, and I think a canny, a shrewd response to the current situation. But certainly, I think America he's right that we need to be united. But I think we've too often tried to unite through rhetoric, through lofty poetic language, as if that would do it. And actually, he's talking about the hard work of actually creating a more concrete unity. And maybe not hiding behind that high-flown rhetoric is a good sign, actually.
Actually, it's kind of interesting, because I also kept coming back to your book after. He's also in a way a shapeshifter. You could say he has a very long career in Washington. And I thought back to your book when in the summer, after he had a very not that inspiring primary season, and suddenly everybody got behind Biden because someone had to beat Donald Trump, even though he's 80, and people really worried he was going to faint on stage at some point. But no one really thought it was going to do much in a way. So there was the general feeling. And then suddenly these kinds of articles kept popping up. Biden is thinking of the FDR-sized presidency. And that was the connection he wanted to draw. And you could tell there wasn't the narrative that went away. And I thought, well, maybe this is a kind of Churchwell story in a way, like the Trump presidency in a way, the Gilded Age. He is literally a gilded person. He's gilded. Gilt is in a person, basically, like just cheap metal with a gold paint on it. And, I mean, as unlikely as it is, but I think there might be, at least as a narrative, there might be space for a kind of figure that tries to open up something that seemed very closed, even in the Obama presidency, when it was all about trying to make this work somehow, not anger policemen, not anger whites, not anger Wall Street. And that's what you were referring to as well.
Mm. Absolutely.
I'm thinking about, there's like an heir apparent, I think, in the government right now. Like one secret that I'm amazed about, people didn't really talk a lot about during the election, is that Biden is probably not going to run again in 4 years, and he will want his vice president to be president. And so I'm wondering, will America change enough up until then to make a woman and a Black person be able to get this space you were talking about, or will it just not repeat but rhyme itself with the Obama presidency, at least in the election campaign, whoever she will campaign against if she's the nominee?
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that I think is really, really important. So first of all, I'll say a little bit about Biden, and then I'll turn to Harris. I think that Biden is very underestimated. He has been a very successful figure on Capitol Hill for 50 years. You don't do that if you're naive and you're a bumbler and you don't know how Congress works. He is an operator. He's a ruthless operator. He wouldn't be where he is if he weren't. That's just QED. And so he understands how politics works. He is somebody who, Mitch McConnell, there was only one Republican who came to Beau Biden's funeral, to Joe Biden's elder son, his funeral when he died in 2015, and that was Mitch McConnell. Joe Biden is friends with these people. He goes back 50 years with a lot of these people. He knows how to make a deal. Obama was stymied in part because he was Black, absolutely. In part because he was a Democrat, and they were going to stop any Democrat. And we'll see how far this old friendship with Biden goes. And those partisan divides are very real and very deep. And I'm not underplaying them at all. I'm not suggesting that Biden and McConnell are going to go have a beer and sign a bill together or anything. That is not going to happen.
With Mitch McConnell.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So the former Senate Majority Leader, who's now the Minority Leader, but he has been the main obstacle in getting any kind of legislation through. And certainly, he's the one who blocked Obama all the way through his presidency. But my point was simply that Biden understands how all of that works. He understands it much better than the way he's caricatured in the media would suggest. And so I think that we are. He's in a better position. And as I say, he has more permission as a white man to do some of this stuff. So I'm hopeful that he can get some of this stuff through. The Democrats do keep bringing pillows to a knife fight, and I wish they would fight harder. I think we have to fight harder. But it is difficult because there's also that saying about, I'm sure there's a German version of this, but in America, it's don't wrestle with a pig because you'll get covered in mud and the pig will enjoy it, right? And so that's, don't lower yourself because you just end up as low as they are and you don't get anywhere, which of course is what Trump was a master at, was bringing everybody down to his level, degrading everybody, and he still wins because he has no depth to his, to that degradation. So you want to be the person who has scruples. You want to be the person who has principles and values. You don't want to pull out a knife. The whole point is to get knives out of politics. But you also can't be the person bringing a pillow to a knife fight. So it's tricky. In terms of what Biden might be paving the way for, I I think he takes great pride in having been the vice president who helped usher in the first Black president and help support him and help make that possible. I think he knows that that will be his historic place, you know, or one of his major historical contributions to the American record. I think he would love to be the man who could also bring in the first, help create the conditions. Not that he would like take credit for it, obviously, but that he was the person who helped support that and nurture it and make it possible. If he could also be the person who he has now been the person who has brought in the first female and Black vice president. And if he could then, you know, create and also she's, you know, Asian American, Indian, all of those, her mixed heritage is actually really important for the way that she symbolizes those possibilities to many communities. So I think that he would be very proud of that and he'd like to do it. He has said that he sees himself as a transitional president, that he's not trying to cling on to power. That would be the one way in which he's not like FDR. He's not going to try to run for 3 terms. He's not quite 80, you know, you said he's 80, he's only 78. He's got, let's give him those 2 years. But he is, certainly. He is the oldest American president in history without, you know, certainly. Your much tougher question is, in 4 years, will America be ready to vote for a mixed race woman as president? That depends entirely on what happens in the next 4 years. And it depends entirely on how much the Democrats are able to get out their base and how much the kind of Stacey Abrams model of bringing out African-American voters, particularly African-American women, and activating that vote, how far that can take the Democrats. Because clearly the kind of, you know, the white male MAGA voter of Trump is not going to turn around and vote for Kamala Harris. That's just not going to happen.
So thank you so much. And before we go to the audience questions for the last section of this, I want to plug, because it's just the perfect moment, an event we have tomorrow with the former ambassador to Germany and his wife, John Emerson and Kimberly Emerson, who are personal friends of Kamala Harris. They're going to be with us tomorrow at 7, talking to Suda David Wilp of the German Marshall Fund, so that you can get the next shot, basically. And so I'm going to shut up and read a question from Patricia or Patricia. Thank you to Sarah for giving all you. Okay. Thank you, Sarah, for giving, and you all for organizing this talk. This is very good grammar for chat. Riveting and informative. My question, Sarah, you've been rightfully pointing to the Republicans for already trying to forcibly move on. But are you at all worried about that every momentum towards reckoning with the past on the parts of liberals will subside now that Joe Biden is president, and especially with Kamala as VP? Kind of, look at her, we can't be racists and sexists. Okay, this is a very...
Yeah, well, look, I think that I took a lot of comfort over the summer when Biden was asked by an interviewer if he would pardon Trump if he became president. And Biden said, without hesitating, he said, hell no, right? I mean, it was just like instinctive. So I don't think that in terms of the kind of move to unity, that the Biden administration is going to be interested in papering over these cracks and making it all go away. Will the Democrats start to just, you know, pat themselves on the shoulder that say, oh, it's okay, you know, now we're you know, America's not racist because Kamala Harris is in office? I don't think so, because that's what happened with Obama. And it's too recent a memory, to our point about, you do have to have at least 20 years, I think, before you, even in America, before you can forget everything. And that's exactly what happened with Obama, right? But you know, to be fair to Americans, it wasn't only Americans who said this. I was in debates and arguments and almost like, you know, fistfights with British commentators who were telling me that Obama proved that America wasn't racist anymore. And I said, well, then you haven't been to America, because you're out of your mind. And this was in 2008, you know, you're out of your mind if you think that electing one Black man is going to make America not be racist. It's not how it works. So hopefully we've learned at least that lesson, or at least the liberals have learned that lesson, that one, that one election does not prove anything. And of course, with all of the horrors and the political horrors of the last few years, and all the Black Lives Matter protests of this, past year, the killing of George Floyd, the ways in which we have seen these atrocities over and over and over again, I think you have to be very, very dishonest indeed as a liberal and as a progressive to say, I believe that racism shouldn't happen. We've got a black, brown, vice president. And so it doesn't matter that all of these Black people are getting murdered in the streets every day. Like, I don't think they can just make that go away. But, as we've said, they've got a powerful, willful desire for amnesia that we see over and over and over again. And so, I don't say it's impossible, but I hope it's unlikely.
So Debbie asked, and I hope Debbie has understood me better, because previously she said I was hard to understand. I hope that's not everybody's experience.
Oh, no. I find you very easy to understand.
Yeah, me too. But I try to move closer to my screen anyway. So Professor Churchwell, Debbie writes, do you think that actions such as reparations for descendants of slaves and the removal of statues and monuments commemorating Confederate heroes would contribute significantly to reconciliation with America's inglorious past?
It's a really, really good question. And it's actually, there's two different answers there. I think that because the reparations for slaves is much, much harder than removing statues. Yes, the statues has been very contested and very angry, but at the end of the day, it doesn't cost anybody anything to take down some statues. And I think that's a really important part of what we need to do, absolutely, because statues are not history. Statues are not at all history. They are glorification and commemoration, and they're there to talk about, they're there to aggrandize certain figures or moments in your own history. And just as, we were using this analogy at the beginning, and I think it's completely reasonable, just as Germany does not have any more statues to Nazis, so America should not have any more statues to white supremacists who murdered Black people. We should not be glorifying people who murdered Black people and enslaved Black people. Like, that's just wrong. And it's uncomplicatedly wrong. So it should be easy to remove the statues. It's not, but it should be. And they will, but it is easier, and they'll come down. I'm very confident they'll come down, and gradually, they won't all come down tomorrow, but they will come down. And I think most of them will end up in museums, which in my opinion is where they belong. So I don't think you destroy them. I think you put them in museums, and that's part of how you tell your history. And you say, we had this period where we glorified this, and now we don't glorify this anymore. So to me, that's the solution. Reparations is not as simple because it will cost people money. And once it costs people money, I think you can, particularly in America right now, reparations are not going to happen. It's not even in, to me, it's such a hypothetical that it's not really worth spending a lot of time talking about. And I don't mean that dismissively about the question, because it's a really, really important question. And it is certainly one that there is a very lively and active debate about in America. And there are really good cases for it. I believe I'm very convinced by some of those cases for it. And I would not actually necessarily fight against. So, there are arguments that reparations, for example, would do more immediate good than a universal basic income in America. And that it would actually, I've seen some claims that it would cost less, but I'm not an economist, so I don't know if that's actually true or not. But I think those are interesting and important proposals and important debates for us to have. But politically, that's a non-starter. That's not going anywhere politically right now. So to me, it's just a hypothetical balloon that we can talk about for a while and maybe, and keep it alive, so that I'm not saying we push it aside because it's important, but it's not going to happen right now.
Actually, one thing that always fascinated me, that like we didn't really have the statue problem in Germany, because there's another parallel. Because apparently, I didn't learn this that long ago, but Hitler wasn't fond of statues of himself. He preferred to be to have streets named after him. So there was much less effort to just get rid of a few street signs instead of statues. Great.
I did not know that, but he did like his architecture. You guys had a lot of buildings.
So Stefan has a question for you. He would like to know if you see any signs and or possibilities for the left to reclaim the American dream as a bulwark against free-range capitalism. That's actually one question I didn't get to, so thank you, Stefan.
Yes, thank you very much. I say at the end of the book that I think it can, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is that I want people to be aware, and it's like what I was saying earlier about the contingency of history, that if it could mean this once, it could mean it again. There's no reason why we can't reclaim that meaning. We don't even have to try to, say a word means something new. We just say, this is an old meaning and we want it back. So it's possible. Again, to my point about reparations, do I think it's likely? Not at the moment. But if everybody in the United States read my book and understand it and agreed with me, then we might get there. So that's obviously my goal, is to make sure that every single person reads my book, because then they will understand all of American history. Because obviously I solve all problems and explain everything in my book. But I mean, look, I do think that, as I say in the book, all kidding aside, I think that it can be liberating to learn that the things that you think have only ever meant one thing can and did mean something else. And it just, to me, it opens up the possibilities. And it takes us maybe full circle, Renee, back to your points about, is this comforting or not? One of the things that to me is comforting in recovering this is to know that there were better options, and that just that there were other options. This isn't the only way we can be. And this isn't the only way that we can understand ourselves. And even the American dream, which is such a capitalistic, free market slogan, as I said, that was once on the progressive left. Well, you can get depressed about that and say, well, free market capitalism really has won out, hasn't it? Which is certainly one way of, it's certainly not untrue. But that meaning's not dead either. And so, I think the progressive left needs a rallying cry, and to reclaim that might be, one way. I'd certainly like to see it. It would make me happy, but I think the American dream might be too problematic right now for that to work. It's just so freighted with so many different meanings. We might just need to start over. But I would like to see that happen. Yeah.
I suspect that's one. Before I give you the last question we should take for tonight. Actually, that's something I wouldn't put beyond Generation Z, because they have this very distinct internet power, which you've surely come across as well, to just scrap the meaning out of terms and ideas and just put it in a completely different frame of mind. And I, as a millennial, feel very powerless to them. They seem like a very powerful generation, while ours is just very melancholic in a way. Maybe as a footnote to what you just said. But I have another question, which connects to the point of rallying cry for liberals. Someone wants to know if liberals need an equivalent to Fox News. I would say that's MSNBC though, maybe, and similar media outlets, or is that the wrong approach to politics? And also, is there a connection between the Tea Party and the MAGA sycophants? So twofold question.
Yes, well, the MAGA sycophant is a really good phrase. The MAGA sycophants are absolutely the outgrowth of the Tea Party, and they are supported by some of the Tea Party. So Nikki Haley got her start in the Tea Party, and obviously Rand Paul. And so a lot of the people, and so the new members of Congress who may or may not have been involved in the insurrection, people like Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene, we thought the Tea Party was terrible in 2010 because its ignorance was really, well, not, I mean, people laughed at it, but it was worrying. But now we have, Tommy Tuberville, who's just been elected to the Senate, who believes that World War II was fought to save Europe from socialism. So you heard it from him. And you'll have to go rewrite your history books now, I'm afraid. So that's the extension, the Tea Party, 2.0, and it's even worse. So absolutely, we're looking at the next iteration of the Tea Party, I'm sorry to say, and we're looking at a massive failure of the American educational system, very obviously. So that's one of the things that needs to be addressed systemically if we're going to move forward. I forgot now what the first part of the question was. What was the first part of the question?
If liberals need an equivalent to Fox News.
Oh, yeah. So no, I don't believe that that's the answer. And I agree with Renee to a certain extent that that's why MSNBC was set up. But the difference I would say is that MSNBC and all of the other so-called liberal media that that Fox News and the right wing like to rail against, and this is also true here in the UK, is that the so-called liberal media always have conservative commentators on. And the actual right-wing media never has liberal commentators on. They never have liberal points of view. MSNBC has conservatives on all the time. CNN has conservatives on all the time. It had it all the way through the coverage. They have Rick Santorum, the former GOP governor of Pennsylvania, who is, you know, an apologist for the GOP, you know, 99% of the time. And that's CNN. But Fox never has liberal people on their programs. I mean, maybe, you know, once, you know, a year or something. And so I believe we have to get back to a more regulated broadcast news system in which we used to have what we called the Fairness Doctrine. Most Western democracies have some version about the obligation to present something like objective fact. And we have to get away from both sides being, you know, as we've all now realized, to say that climate change is a lie is not the other side of the climate change debate. The two sides of the climate change debate are what should we do about climate change, because climate change is a fact. So the debate is what is the right solution, not is climate change real. And in my view, we have to move back to thinking about our political debates that way. We agree what the facts are, and then we have debates about what to do about those facts, rather than to have people on who are arguing that the facts are not real. So Fox News has to be shut down in some way. It can't keep existing in its current form and have America survive. I think it's more to blame for where we are than any other single source. And what will be very interesting is that to see whether those who live by the sword die by the sword, because the degree to which it may actually be civil lawsuits and commercial actions for defamation by actors like the Dominion voting machines, which sued Rudy Giuliani for $1.3 billion yesterday. And that raised $1.3 billion. And that raised questions about whether they might also sue Fox News, because Fox News was busily libeling Dominion as well for months. So it would be very interesting to me if capitalism eats capitalism in this, so that the justice system couldn't keep everything at bay, and God knows Congress was useless in all of this. But it will be very interesting if it's actually the commercial effects that bring Fox News down. That may not be good news for America, because who knows what will grow in its place, but it will certainly be poetic justice, and it will be interesting to watch. And you know, we've seen the degree to which in the years that Fox News has been in the ascendancy, the only thing that has counted has been those lawsuits, like the sexual harassment lawsuits that brought down Roger Ailes. Those have been the only ways in which those companies are held to account in the United States, are through cold hard cash and through individual lawsuits. So it may be that things like the Dominion lawsuit are the next step for Fox News, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, that's actually the perfect ending, because that's also what Trump always liked to say. We'll have to see. But of course, in this case, it's actually true. So I want to thank all the people posing questions to Sarah. I want to correct myself, because tomorrow's event with the Emersons and Suda David Wood is at 6 Middle European time, not 7. 7 is always the beginning for our Transatlantic Tuesdays. Tomorrow will be outside of that framework. We will continue the series with Walter Scheidel, as I've mentioned in German in the beginning, the famous Stanford historian, and with Anne Applebaum, for example, in April, in March and April. Lots of stuff to look forward to. And most of all, I want to thank Sarah so much for joining us tonight. It's been a real dream come true for me. It's been so fun talking to you. I want to encourage everybody to order her book at the local bookstore. They have it. They can order it for you. Behold America, A History of America First and the American Dream. You should also follow Sarah on Twitter. I would be remiss if I wouldn't mention it. She is excellent on Twitter, which is owned by Generation Z, of course, as everything will be eventually, but she rules it anyway. Thank you, Sarah, so much for doing this.
Thank you very much, Renee. Thank you. That's very kind, and I really enjoyed that. Wonderful questions. Thank you all very much.
And with that, I want to wish everybody a good night and have a good week. Goodbye.
Good night.